the committee in recess at any point. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the threats posed by the Chinese Communist Party to U.S. national security. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today's hearing focuses on the generational threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to our homeland. The first step is to recognize the nature of our adversary. For decades, China has steadily pursued a long-term grand strategy to replace the United States as the leading global power. We cannot afford wishful thinking or willful ignorance about the nature of the Chinese regime and its ongoing efforts to undermine the United States. We also need proactive measures to counter the CCP's actions that jeopardize our homeland security, especially given that most of the threats they pose are unfolding now below the threshold of traditional conflict. One of our distinguished witnesses, Dr. Michael Pillsbury, has persuasively argued that China is engaged in a 100-year marathon, a grand strategy to surpass and overtake the United States on the world stage and reorder the world according to the CCP's priorities and their values. This long-term strategy is comprehensive. It is not limited to military capabilities. It includes the full range of economic, diplomatic, technological, and political competition. Critically, China is willing to play the long game and build up its power over the course of decades. The CCP's ultimate aim is not to enjoy a peaceful balance of power with the West, but to establish its position as the dominant world power. A world oriented around the vision and values of the CCP would look very different from the unparalleled freedom and prosperity produced by the Pax Americana. In contrast, the Chinese vision would mean a global order subordinate to the desires and the interest of a totalitarian communist regime. In recent years, the People's Republic of China has engaged in sustained campaigns of transnational repression, intellectual property theft, and espionage here in the United States. Over the past 4 years, there have been more than 60 espionage cases across 20 states linked to the CCP. Operations to gather intelligence on sensitive military information and the theft of technology and trade secrets. Just this past December, a Chinese citizen was arrested for flying a drone over Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. He was apprehended at the airport trying to board a flight back to China. Additionally, agents of Beijing have targeted dissidents and regime critics within the United States through covert Chinese police stations in New York City and other major U.S. cities. Espionage, including economic and technology theft, are key to the CCP strategy to undermine the United States while fueling its own technological advancement. Today, the United States remains unmatched as a hub for technological innovation, but the PRC routinely and systematically steals technology and research from American companies and universities for the benefit of the Chinese state industrial complex. Many Chinese corporations are state-owned enterprises, and China's national security laws give the regime the power to force companies to hand over any information or data. Moreover, the CCP has implemented a national strategy of military-civil fusion to position the People's Liberation Army as the dominant military power by 2049. Part of this strategy is mass intellectual property theft of sensitive information from both U.S. military and civilian targets. The CCP exploits American research and development to the tune of several $100 billion every single year. And this theft directly affects all Americans. As one of our witnesses today will state, these losses cost the average American family of four between $4,000 and $6,000 yearly. This is happening through traditional espionage tactics and targeted cyber attacks affecting industries engaged in innovative developments ranging from military technology and artificial intelligence to semiconductors and medical research. Here in the 119th Congress, this committee has the opportunity to advance significant legislation to counter the CCP's effort to undermine our national security. Working together, we can find practical policy solutions to shift the playing field in our favor, whether we are countering acts of transnational repression, strengthening our cybersecurity with legislation like the Cyber Pivot Act, or shoring up our economic security and supply chain resilience. We can make major headway on meeting the challenges posed by the PRC. The freedoms and prosperity of the American people in the decades to come depend on our courage, on our foresight, and our ability to take decisive action now. I look forward to a serious discussion on the critical threats posed by the CCP to the United States homeland as we kick off this committee's effort to protect the homeland against foreign actors. I now at this time recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin my statement, let me say with a heavy heart that we've been informed that a member of this committee, Mr. Sylvester Turner, former mayor of Houston, passed early this morning. And at some point, we will do a more formal recognition of his tenure on the committee by the committee. So we wanted to make that part of just people knowing. Good morning and welcome to our panel of witnesses. Today, the committee is examining the threats posed by the Chinese Communist Party to our national security. The threats are very real. The CCP is looking for every opportunity to undermine our security and get the upper hand on the global United States. The problem is congressional Republicans' tough talk on China is at odds with the Trump administration's actions, which are hurting America's ability to counter threats from the CCP. For example, China is carrying out cyber attacks for espionage to the preposition for attacks against our critical infrastructure in the event of future conflicts. According to the intelligence community's 2024 Worldwide Threat Assessment, China remains the most active and persistent cyber threat to the United States government, private sector, and critical infrastructure networks. Unbelievably, President Trump has fired key cybersecurity personnel at the Department of Homeland Security and dismissed members of the Cyber Safety Review Board investigating recent Chinese attacks. We are hearing that up to 50% of the remaining workforce of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency might be targeted in the days ahead. Let's be clear, the Trump administration gutting U.S. cyber defenses makes it harder to protect Americans against Chinese cyber attacks and makes us less safe. What are congressional Republicans doing to preserve the workforce that protects our cyber networks? Nothing. Meanwhile, in its rush to fire government employees, the Trump administration sent out an unclassified email with the names of CIA analysts and operatives working to counter China. One former CIA officer referred to the email as a, quote, counterintelligence nightmare. What are congressional Republicans doing to stop the White House chaos and protect intelligence information from Chinese hackers? Nothing. China is also on a mission to steal our economic secrets and personal data to gain a competitive advantage. Fortunately for China, Elon Musk is lending a hand. Musk and his Doge lackeys have made key federal data systems more vulnerable and put millions of Americans' data at risk by snooping in sensitive cyber networks without adequate security protections. What are congressional Republicans doing to protect Americans' personal data from Musk, Doge, and possible exploitation by China? Nothing. Additionally, China is using its Belt and Road Initiative to leverage investments to expand its influence in the developing world. Rather than protecting America's interests globally, the Trump-Musk administration slashed U.S. foreign investment and alienated allies and partners, undermining our ability to compete with China for influence on the global stage. This morning, the Supreme Court rejected the Trump-Musk administration efforts to end the U.S. foreign investment, clearing the way for the State Department and USAID to restart nearly $2 billion in payments. But what are congressional Republicans doing to protect American interests around the world? Nothing. The Trump administration is weakening America against China, while Elon Musk sits inside the White House, asserting seemingly limitless influence over the executive branch of government. That's no coincidence. Musk has troublingly close ties with China, though the full extent of his entanglements are unknown because he refuses to file a public financial disclosure and has failed to disclose meetings with Chinese officials. Still, it's clear Musk's businesses rely heavily on China for their success, and he has over $1 billion in loans from state-owned Chinese banks. Musk has taken public stances to benefit of China and has even suggested giving some control over Taiwan to China. His own former Doge co-chair raised concerns about Musk's ties to China, saying, "I have no reason to think Elon won't jump like a circus monkey when Chinese President Xi Jinping calls in the hour of need." That doesn't sound like America first. It sounds like China first. What are congressional Republicans doing to sound the alarm about someone beholding to China running our government? Nothing. Democrats agree that the CCP poses a threat to U.S. security and want to keep Americans safe. If Republicans want to counter China's influence and protect U.S. interests, they should start by holding their own administration accountable. Talking tough on China, but bending the knee to Trump and Musk plays right into the CCP's hands. Let's hope the other side remembers their oath is to the Constitution and not to the man in the White House or his unelected billionaire co-president. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Before we move forward, in light of the announcement by Ranking Member Thompson regarding the passing of Sylvester Turner, I would like us to please take a moment of silence to remember him and to recognize his service. Thank you. Other members of the committee are recognized and reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. I had the opportunity to visit with each of you very briefly before the commencement of this hearing. So thank you for your dedication, your commitment. I know that you are all subject matter experts in this field. Something that is extremely important to us, to this committee, to this Congress, and to this administration. I want to again thank you for being here. I would ask if you would at this time please raise your right hand as I issue the oath. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative, and thank you for taking such an oath. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. First, Dr. Michael Pillsbury. He is a renowned China scholar and author of the 100 Years Marathon, China's secret strategy to replace America as the global superpower. He has served in many distinguished governmental roles, including as an Assistant Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Planning Special Assistant. He served as a Special Assistant for Asian Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a Senior Fellow for China Strategies at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Pillsbury earned his PhD from Columbia University. The Honorable William Evans is a former director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, in which he led the United States government's counterintelligence activities. As director, he oversaw key national programs dedicated to countering intelligence collection efforts by foreign adversaries. Prior to serving as director of the NCSC, he serves as the chief of the CIA's counter-espionage group. He has over 31 years of service in the federal government, including 24 years as a special agent with the Bureau of Investigations, including service as Assistant Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Washington field office. Next is Mr. Craig Singleton. Craig is a Senior Director of the China Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He is a leading expert on U.S.-China relations, an expert on China's technological threat and China's military-civil fusion strategy. He previously served as a U.S. diplomat focusing on national security issues dealing with China, North Korea, and the Indo-Pacific. Finally, Dr. Rush Doshi is the CV Star Senior Fellow for Asian Studies and Director of the China Strategies Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Joshi was Deputy Senior Director for China and Taiwan on the National Security Council from 2021 to 2024. He is also an assistant professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I would now like to recognize each of you for 5 minutes to summarize your remarks in the form of an opening statement. I will begin with Dr. Pillsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman and Ranking Member Thompson. Mark Green, your chairman, advised me I should try to say something new and fresh and assume that the members of the Homeland Security Committee are all highly informed about China already and don't need a presentation from me that says, the capital city is Beijing and the population is 1.4 billion. So I'll try to meet his challenge. He said, why don't you go back to your book 10 years ago, where you recommended 12 steps in the last chapter, and then tell us which of the 12 remain to be implemented. It's kind of hard because only the first one was implemented. The first one was to recognize our long-term competition with China. 10 years ago, that was kind of strange. Now, pretty much everybody talks as though it's common knowledge. So that's 1 out of 12. The other 11, I'm not going to mention all, but I'm going to mention 3 that are, I think, relevant to this Homeland Security Committee, because I used to be a Senate staffer. My first job in 1978 in the Senate staff was the Senate Budget Committee. And I learned a lesson fairly quickly. The jurisdiction of committees is something senators fight over. So if we could have something unique that Homeland Security does itself, with your Senate partner, Rand Paul, as well, there's some areas that need to be looked at that could be done just by your committee. Now, don't get angry at me, but one of the first things is to consider this committee going to Beijing, not just foreign affairs and foreign relations and armed services travel, but Homeland Security with a well-organized agenda agreed to in advance by the Chinese could answer questions you have and also would be a kind of healthy pressure on how the Chinese see America's requests. The second idea I have is that Homeland Security's jurisdiction includes a lot of agencies. And one of my most important recommendations 10 years ago is we try to do a survey, even annual if necessary, of exactly what each government department or agency is doing to assist China. And the head of OMB tried to do this. He's back now again as the head of OMB. He put out a very specific kind of document to all government agencies. Define what you're doing to help China one way or another. It was defined very broadly. How much money is involved, and yes or no, do you have authority from Congress to do this? And the study ran into enormous difficulties. Agencies did not want to admit that they each had a program with China, and none of them had congressional authorization to do what they were doing. One of these was helping the labor union disputes. Labor Department was sending mediators. Another one was the Chinese banks were in trouble. So a team from the controller of the currency went out to show Chinese banks, state-owned banks, how better to measure non-performing loans. All of these programs, or maybe as many as 20, were designed originally when our relationship with China was one of sort of the older brother helping China get into the world. All that's changed, but these programs continue on. Many of them are under the jurisdiction of this committee. The other idea, because of limits of time, let me just kind of dwell on it for 30 seconds. The other idea was, if we're in a long-term competition with China, how do we know where we're going? How do we know the most effective measures that need to be adopted? And you all know the Mad Hatter and Alice in Wonderland, when any road, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. That's kind of the situation we're in now with the picture of the long-term competition. How is it going to end? I can tell you what the Chinese say. A very common scenario, talking with Chinese or reading their materials, is they think America is looking for another Gorbachev and wants the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party, Russian style. Very, very similar concerns. Xi Jinping has spoken on this himself many times. There's never going to be a China Gorbachev. So they're very defensive about it. They're prepared for it. Rather strangely, we're not doing this. As far as I know, the United States government is not trying to put a Gorbachev in China and overthrow the CCP, anything from it. There are several other scenarios. Each scenario, each outcome suggests a different set of measures we should do. But to measure how we're doing in the competition I proposed has not been done. There's no annual report on how are we doing vis-a-vis, let's say, 20 or 30 indicators with China. So we're working in the dark. Some professors have worked on this. There's several good books about it, but there's no White House annual report on how we're doing in the competition with China, let's say for 20 or 30 indicators. That's a vacuum that this committee could help to fill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pillsbury. I now recognize Mr. Evanana for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Acting Chairman Guest, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee, it's an honor to be here today with my esteemed guests. September 11, 2001, our nation was attacked by committed terrorists. As a nation, we were not prepared for this attack or how it would impact every aspect of American lives for decades to come. As a special agent in the FBI in that day, I was part of the investigation of Flight 93. From that day, and throughout my entire law enforcement intelligence career, I often ask myself, how do we not see this coming? Maybe we could have prevented it. We saw the lights blinking. As a nation, we worked tirelessly for 25 years to prevent that from happening again. We were committed. Today, our nation faces an array of sophisticated, diverse threats by terror organizations, cyber criminals, and nation-state threat actors. I proffer to you The greatest threat to our nation emanates from the Communist Party of China. This threat is existential, it is complex, pernicious, and strategic, with the U.S. private sector and academia the main battlefield. Xi Jinping drives a comprehensive and whole-of-country approach to the CCP's efforts to invest, leverage, infiltrate, paralyze, influence, and steal from every aspect and every corner of America. As this committee is aware, the economic loss of theft of intellectual property and trade secrets just from the Communist Party of China is estimated between $300 billion and $600 billion per year. To make that more relevant to everyone in this room, as the acting chairman mentioned, it's about $4,000 to $6,000 per year per American family of four after taxes. Additionally, it's estimated that 80% of all Americans have had all of their personal data stolen by the Communist Party of China in the past decade. The other 20%, just most of it. And data has become the new gold in the world. The CCP's priorities to collect it are second to none like we've ever seen. And as we all know, data is the bedrock fundamental purpose for all artificial intelligence creation. Layering onto our economic hemorrhaging is the unprecedented Volt and Salt Typhoon hacks, which continue to persist in our critical infrastructure and telecommunications sectors, respectively. The CCP's recent actions also include sophisticated surveillance balloons, technical surveillance stations in Cuba, maritime port control, strategic land purchases near military bases, fentanyl, TikTok, malign foreign influence at the local level, etc. Altogether, the collage begins to paint a bleak picture far beyond blinking red. Our current domestic vulnerability is unacceptable. The blinking lights are clear. I believe we must approach this existential threat with the same sense of urgency, leadership, spending, and strategy as we have done for the past 2 decades in defeating and preventing terrorism. I would ask this committee, is it not a terrorism when our electrical grid or natural gas pipeline is disabled or damaged via Volt Typhoon malware? That will result in millions of households, hospitals, buildings being without heat, electricity. What about when our telecommunications infrastructure, to include Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, are all being disabled on the same day due to an organized cyber attack precipitated by Salt Typhoon? And if our financial services sector was impacted and had to go offline just for a few hours, it would cause immeasurable harm, as well as significant domestic and international chaos, societal panic, and disruption we have not seen since 9/11. Are these not terrorism-type events? And if these events incidentally occur on the same day as the CCP makes their inevitable move on Taiwan, are we even ready as a nation to handle the paralysis and chaos the CCP will cause from every aspect of our American life, from commerce, health, safety, and the way we live every day? The CCP has strategically planned and implemented the ability to do just this, all at once and all across our homeland, from our ports to our electrical grid. Additionally, every aspect of these actions has a planned impact on societal chaos and panic. It is an integral part of the CCP's plan and strategy. Hence, terrorism and terror must be redefined beyond our framework where we historically look at kinetic actions that harm or kill their loved ones. The inability or unwillingness to look behind this curtain and visualize this clear, realistic scenario is no longer an option for anyone. In fact, the proverbial curtain no longer exists. Our nation needs strategic leadership now more than ever. Time is of the essence. Additionally, this will take a whole-of-country approach. This approach starts here with the U.S. Congress. We all see the blinking lights clearly. I offer a nationwide call to action, committing to reduce the brightness, reduce the cadence of these very clear and blinking lights. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Evanilla. I now recognize Mr. Singleton for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Acting Chairman Guest, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm pleased to offer policy insights from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a nonpartisan research institute where I serve as a senior fellow. Chinese Communist Party Chairman Xi Jinping has declared technological innovation the, quote, main battlefield in China's quest for global preeminence. For Xi, Chinese-style modernization is not merely an economic goal, It's a historic mandate with grave implications for U.S. national security. In seeking to dominate what he calls China's new productive forces, breakthroughs in batteries, biotech, LiDAR, drones, robotics, and other cutting-edge technologies, Xi seeks to cement Chinese control over the drivers of the next industrial revolution. In doing so, Xi intends to transform China into a global science superpower. Yet Xi's strategy is predicated on a glaring vulnerability. It depends, in part, on sustained access to U.S. capital markets and advanced technology, as well as near unfettered reach into American data and critical infrastructure systems. On this front, U.S. policymakers must act decisively and without delay. Xi's broader technological ambitions underpin China's military-civil fusion strategy, a doctrine that breaks down barriers between the People's Liberation Army and China's civilian institutions, including Chinese universities and ostensibly private Chinese companies. This fusion accelerates the transfer of scientific innovations directly into China's defense and intelligence sectors, ensuring that Chinese military capabilities evolve in lockstep with civilian progress. Here at home, Beijing's strategy unfolds in three interlocking phases. First, Chinese actors relentlessly penetrate U.S. networks and critical infrastructure, harvesting vast troves of sensitive data in the process. Recently exposed Chinese state-sponsored hacking campaigns, Salt, Volt, and Flax Typhoon, reveal how Beijing exploits software vulnerabilities, implants malicious code, and maintains persistent backdoors. More than a year after these breaches became public, Chinese hackers still enjoy near persistent access to U.S. telecommunications networks, with Washington yet to impose any meaningful costs. But hacking and data theft are just the opening gambit. Beijing's secondary goal is to systematically pre-position itself within our networks to degrade or disrupt them at critical junctures, both in peace and in conflict. By embedding compromised cranes in U.S. ports, Chinese-made LiDAR devices in traffic control, or drones that seamlessly integrate with civilian and military operations, Beijing gains a silent veto over our crisis response. Whether through biotech innovations or batteries powering our grid, each dependency transforms market reliance into a strategic liability. In times of tension, the mere suspicion that these systems might be sabotaged could erode confidence, delay U.S. responses, and undermine our deterrent posture. Third, China profits from this dual approach. Chinese high-tech exports from advanced sensors and biotech to drones and surveillance cameras generate billions in revenue every year for Beijing. This revenue is funneled back into military-civil fusion programs, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of power. What's more, by converting market access into geopolitical leverage, the CCP has weaponized Western dependence on its technologies, thereby undercutting U.S. competitiveness. In response to these provocations, it's vital that policymakers act with both urgency and clarity. By levying meaningful penalties, including robust outbound investment screening, targeted export controls, and stringent procurement bans on high-risk Chinese technologies, Washington can deny Xi the leverage he seeks and compel China to reassess its aggressive posture. If we fail to act, every hacked network, every compromised supply chain, and every dependency engineered by Beijing only heightens our vulnerability to disruption, sabotage, or even systemic failure during a crisis. In many respects, today's predicament recalls the late stages of the Cold War, when Washington's misguided embrace of peaceful coexistence inadvertently prolonged the Soviet system's survival, treating it as an immutable juggernaut rather than one susceptible to sustained internal and external pressure. By minimizing accountability for Chinese espionage, coercion, and violations of international norms, we risk reinforcing Beijing's conviction that its revanchist ambitions need not be curbed. We therefore must act and shift from a misguided policy rooted in reflexive de-escalation to one of assertive reprisal, from passive coexistence with China to purposeful competition on America's terms. On behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I thank you again for inviting me to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Singleton. I now recognize Dr. Joshi for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Guest, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. I'll focus my remarks on some of the challenges China poses to homeland security. 3 questions. First, what are Beijing's ambitions? Second, how does it threaten homeland security in the cyber domain? And third, how does it threaten homeland security with respect to transnational crime? So first, what are Beijing's ambitions? The PRC has a grand strategy to displace U.S.-led order. seeks to, quote, catch up and surpass the U.S. technologically, to make the world dependent on China's supply chains economically, and to acquire the capability to defeat U.S. forces militarily. It's a capable rival, too. It's the leading industrial power with more than 30% of all global manufacturing. It's pursuing military bases around the world and in our backyard, and it's the first U.S. competitor to surpass 70% of U.S. GDP. So the second question, how does the PRC threaten Homeland Security? Well, PRC cyber actors have compromised sensitive U.S. networks with multiple objectives. First, they want American personal data. In the last decade, the PRC has hacked the Office of Personnel Management, Equifax, Marriott, Anthem Health Insurance, and multiple airlines, compromising hundreds of millions of records. Second, they want our IP. The PRC has infiltrated American companies to steal what some estimate as well over $1 trillion of U.S. IP. That even includes compromising cloud providers that handle data for hundreds of companies. And third, they want access to our government systems. In the last 2 years, PRC actors compromised tens of thousands of emails from the State Department, Treasury Department, CFIUS, and even presidential candidates. And fourth, and most concerning, as has been discussed already, they want to prepare the operational environment for wartime in the cyber domain. That is no exaggeration. As we know, senior U.S. officials and corporate leaders, including Microsoft CEO Brad Smith, have indicated that the PRC is pre-positioning for destructive cyber attacks on American power, gas, water, telecom, and transportation infrastructure that would affect the lives of millions of Americans. So what do we do in the cyber domain? In general, we need to shrink our attack surface and go after their attack surface. First, Congress should prohibit technology companies that sell to the USG from operating in China. For example, the US relies on Microsoft software, but to get market access in China, Microsoft provided source code for that software to Beijing. The USG relies on Amazon and Microsoft Cloud, but both Microsoft and Amazon turned over the operation of their cloud services in China to a Chinese company. All this creates vectors of vulnerability. Second, Congress should codify the Information Communication Technology and Services Supply Chain Executive Order and fund the office that administers it. This would let us prohibit certain PRC goods that connect to networks from being in the US market. The Biden administration used this Trump-era tool to keep out PRC-connected vehicles, but that's just the start. Recently, DHS CISA has found backdoors in PRC medical devices, so the time for action is now. Third, we need to go on the offense. If the PRC has accesses on our infrastructure, we need them on theirs as well, and that will take resourcing and staff. The PRC has manpower for that. We don't have enough manpower. This committee has thought about a variety of steps that could help address that, including the Pivot Act. We also have to protect our federal workforce from being cut at a time of peril. Fourth, we need common sense regulation of the private sector, which right now has little incentive to upgrade its cybersecurity. Third and final question, how does the PRC threaten Homeland Security through transnational crime? Well, we all know that 200 Americans die every day from fentanyl overdose. We know the PRC is complicit, and we know that the PRC gives tax rebates and grants to Chinese chemical companies for manufacturing and exporting fentanyl precursors. We know that it allows them to advertise their goods openly on PRC websites, and we know that its underground banks help cartels launder fentanyl profits. They take hard dollars from the cartels in America, they provide them pesos in Mexico, they sell those dollars to Chinese citizens who want their cash out of China, and they take renminbi in compensation within China. All that happens without any money transferring across a border. Well, the PRC has not taken real steps to address it. They tried in 2019, and again, more significantly in 2023, but it wasn't enough. They have the power to stop the precursor flow. They have the power to stop the money laundering, which occurs, by the way, on apps that they control and that they monitor for dissident activity. And if they can find dissidents, they can find money launderers. But they won't do it because they prefer to keep this issue alive so they have leverage with Washington. So what do we do? First, we need to strengthen U.S. sanctions authorities against entities involved in the fentanyl trade, including PRC financial institutions. Second, Congress can link progress on fentanyl to other PRC priorities in consultation with the administration. Third, Congress can pass the Corporate Transparency Act so we can track the beneficial owner of PRC shell companies and crack down on money laundering. And finally, we should pass the HALT Fentanyl Act, to place fentanyl-related substances as a class into Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. I'll end with this. The PRC poses many challenges to our security, but the issues that I focused on in my testimony today are the ones that affect the lives of tens of millions of Americans on a daily basis. The China challenge is often abstract. I think it's important to link it to the lives of everyday Americans. And with that, I thank you for your time and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Members will now be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Singleton, I want to begin with you. In your written testimony that you submitted on page 3 of that testimony, you have there a graph, a chart that is titled Global Leadership of Select Strategic Technologies. And there are 10 technologies that you have listed there. And in each of those, you have identified a global leader. It is troubling to me that it appears that of those global leaders, that the U.S. is the leader in 3 of those categories, and then China is the leader in the other 7. So 70% of those technologies, we see that China has outperformed the United States in those areas, and just want to see if you could talk about that very briefly.
Sure. No, thank you for the question. I mean, it's no mistake that China leads in those sectors for more than a decade, and we are in now 2025, and I think we all remember the China Made in 2025 plan. They decided to put their money where their mouth is. Through intense industrial policy, the theft of our own intellectual property, and through aggressive non-market practices, they were able to invest and scale in some of the largest technology companies in the world, whether it's DJI drones or Hesai LiDAR here in the United States, or CATL batteries. These are Chinese champions that report directly to the Chinese Communist Party. And I think ultimately what we have to start thinking about are some cyber quarantines for some of these high-risk technologies here in the United States. Really treating these systems, these devices, and these companies as inherently risky. We probably need to really restrict, I think, their use in critical infrastructure in particular. And that's an area where I think Congress can make a tremendous impact.
Let me ask you, I've seen, and I'll ask other members, you talk about restricting Chinese access to information. Congress had passed a TikTok ban several months back. We see that currently there has been a stay on that as there are ongoing negotiations between the American and the Chinese government over the ownership of TikTok, particularly by ByteDance, a Chinese company. First, Dr. Singleton, Ms. Singleton, do you have any thoughts on does the Chinese ownership of TikTok, does that pose a threat to Homeland Security, and is that relevant for the hearing that we are having here today?
Absolutely. I mean, Chinese Communist Party Chairman Xi Jinping referred to data as the 21st century oil, and I can't think of any more pernicious threat than the one posed by TikTok.
Now, Dr. Doshi, what are your thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, I would agree, and I would go further and say that one of the challenges that TikTok poses is 180 million Americans can use it to get information. I don't want the control of the algorithm that displays that information to be controlled by Beijing. So I think this is a 100% real security threat.
Mr. Evanilla, do you have an opinion on that?
I would concur with my colleagues and also say that from an intelligence perspective, I think TikTok is one of the greatest intelligence operations ever in the history of the world. And it's targeted directly at America with 180 million people having a device and their ability to control the algorithms, drive their intelligence to our diaspora is harmful at the minimal and potentially devastating in the long run.
And then Dr. Pillsbury.
Well, I agree, but I think I would get back to my main message of the need to rank order priorities of what we're going to do about China. Breaking off the connection between the CCP and TikTok is important, but there's an awful lot of things more important than that that even have some sense of urgency. So it seems to me there's a political warfare or information warfare space that needs more attention. TikTok is part of it. There are other spaces, however, that come under Homeland Security. I'm particularly worried about unregistered foreign agents of China. The Department of Justice in December put out a revision of the Foreign Agents Registration Act that will make it much more difficult for people to take money from China and then lobby. It really tightened up a number of loopholes in the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
Dr. President, let me interrupt you real quick just because my time is running short. 2 quick questions. One, you mentioned about assistance that the United States is providing China. Is there any reason that the United States should be providing China any financial support?
If I'm talking about both private sector up to 2 or 3 trillion, according to Roger Robinson, of American investment in China, and then government agencies that continue to carry out policy that was first set back in the 1970s. That, for example, the FAA in Shanghai helps Chinese airliner manufacturing to be more competitive. The FAA's defense is, well, we're just making sure the airliners are safe. But when you have something like 30 or 40 of these programs, the overall impact seems to me is worth paying attention to, that our government is still officially helping China in many, many sectors. You can get an idea of this by going to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing website, where they list 50 federal agencies that are present in the embassy in Beijing, and then they hint about these are all helping China in various ways. That's what I'm concerned about.
Thank you so much. At this time, my time has expired, and I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Based on the testimony I've heard from all the witnesses this morning, there's no disagreement that China represents a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States. Thank you. And part of that risk associated with that danger is in the cyber field. And I'm, in my testimony, I talked about the fact that a lot of the agencies that are tasked with the responsibility of protecting the United States from China and other rogue nations, we're cutting people. And I want you to talk about whether or not we need to be improving the personnel or technology to protect ourselves. And Dr. Doshi, we can start with you and we can go down the line.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, for the question. Excuse me. I'll say the following. I am concerned that when it comes to staffing and manpower, the PRC is investing a lot more in offensive cyber activity and defensive cyber activity than we are. And so I do worry. You noted a number of cuts, Congressman, in your testimony, in your opening statement, about cuts to DHS-CISA, cuts to the Cybersecurity Review Board, cuts to the teams working on SALT, Typhoon, perhaps 50% cuts in some of the staff. I worry that those cuts come at a time when the Chinese are investing more, that heightens our vulnerability. So if we have to, I would recommend stewarding those resources better for the sake of our national security.
Hey, Dr. Pillsbury, you talked about that the personnel in the embassies that China is investing in. Do you see the personnel issue a challenge for us?
Yes, I do. And one thing that really concerns me, I'm sorry if I advertise my age, but during the Cold War, beginning in 1947, the Congress and the President created new institutions to deal with the Soviet threat. They created the NSC, they created the CIA, they created the U.S. Air Force, they created the Office of the Secretary of Defense. All of this was driven by the perception of a Soviet threat. When you look to China today, despite all the talk, there's no new institution or organization at all that's been created to deal with the China threat. Last night, there was a little mention of it by President Trump when he mentioned shipbuilding, and he wants to create kind of a bureau of shipbuilding to catch up with the Chinese, who, by the way, one figure says they build 300 ships for every one that we build. So again, it's a Homeland Security kind of question. Does the Secretary of Homeland Security need a China unit reporting directly to her? And then what would it look like? How many people? This is the kind of thing I'm most worried about. We're just doing nothing in terms of creating new institutions to deal with China.
Sure. Mr. Vanna, your background in intelligence, what does that say to you about personnel and other things?
Yeah, I would concur with my colleague's statements with respect to resources in the government, but I would also proffer that we need just as many resources, if not more, in the private sector and academia to defend against what China is doing here. When we have 20 of the top 30 companies in our country breached in the last year by the Communist Party of China, we have to allow and facilitate for those corporations from Wall Street to energy to telecoms, be able to best protect them against intelligence apparatuses of the Communist Party of China. We can no longer say, you have to get better and more efficient in the private sector. It's unrealistic to ask a company in the United States to compete and defend against a bona fide intelligence operation around the world.
Mr. Singleton?
I would agree. I mean, the old adage, personnel is policy, is true. I think there are just tremendous opportunity space for Congress to codify programs to build out that tech talent workforce that we need for tomorrow. But I also agree that enhanced private and public sector cooperation is essential here. The private sector is a tremendous force multiplier, particularly in the case of threat intelligence sharing.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from the great state of Texas, former chairman of this committee, and current vice chair, Michael McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first begin, Mr. Ranking Member, in saying my condolences for the passing of Sylvester Turner. I knew him well when he was mayor of Houston, and he just got elected to Congress. And he and his family are in my thoughts and prayers. Dr. Pillsbury, good to see you again. If y'all haven't read his book, 100-Year Marathon, I highly recommend it. It is the authority, I think, on China, communist China. As you know, I prosecuted in 1997 the Johnny Chung case, which led us to China Aerospace and the Chinese intelligence apparatus putting money in his Hong Kong bank account to influence a presidential election, that being President Clinton. And what they wanted was to get into the WTO and to get dual-use technologies, primarily aerospace and satellite technologies. And guess what? They got it. And they continue to get it today. They steal it, but we don't have to sell it to them. Chairing the Foreign Affairs Committee, I put export controls on various things, including NVIDIA chips. In 2024, the problem was, but in 2022, NVIDIA had already sold these chips to China. So that, along with OpenAI, all of a sudden DeepSeek pops up, and we realize that China now has AI technology. In this great power competition, once again, they steal it, but then we sell it to them. I believe that has to stop. I introduced, we saw this with the hypersonic, by the way, built on the backbone of American technology and many other apparatus of the PLA. I introduced the Enforce Act to basically prohibit, through export controls, the sale of military-grade AI technology. I see no reason in the world how we could justify any company in the United States selling to China military-grade AI technology. So, Dr. Pillsbury, in the time I have, can you respond to this? And I'd like to get the bulk of time to you, but to the other three, your opinion as to whether this is a good idea in terms of what we can legislate in the Congress to prevent the sale of this kind of technology.
I've been focusing on what the Homeland Security Committee could do itself. Very narrow picture, but there's a lot of things. I always appreciate mentioning my book and also you alluding to the famous Parler Maid case. Now when we talk about intelligence collection on China, one of the biggest hazards is the use of deception, double agents, against our own intelligence community. This committee has got a wonderful website. You're putting up each of the cases like this on your website. So I just want to commend you. I don't know of other committees that are in real time putting up examples like this. And
when you say Parler Maid, that was my FBI agent, J.J. Smith, sleeping with a Chinese spy that he cultivated as an asset for 10 years, who was reporting back to Beijing.
Intelligence collection is always vulnerable to deception. And in the case of China, I did a study of a lot of textbooks and books on grand strategy, how they see the world, how they see their own history. And the word deception kept coming up over and over and over again. So our problem with foreign intelligence collection, somebody can recruit a really wonderful source or place a wonderful device and get all kinds of intelligence, get promoted, get a bonus. And then all of a sudden it turns out it's a compromised source. In the case of Parler-Made, what I call for in the book is the FBI should have put out a notice that the last, let's say, 25 reports by Parler-Made probably were under the control of Chinese intelligence and were false. Xi was trying to mislead us, probably under orders from the president of China, who she claimed to be friends with. So I'm always glad to hear you raise the Parler-Made case. It's still with us, I think, in many ways.
And it's taught at Quantico with the FBI. You know, do you any thoughts on the Enforce Act? I know it's a different committee, and I apologize for that, but this is the Congress as a whole. Would that be a smart thing for us to do?
Yes, I think so. But before you came in, I hope you'll forgive me. I advocated that this committee visit China with a well-organized agenda of questions. If the Chinese accept and give you the right people to see, you could go into the fentanyl issue, you could go into things that are in your jurisdiction, and hopefully the House Foreign Affairs Chairman would not block Homeland Security visiting China.
I don't think so, but I've been sanctioned. That may be a problem for me personally. And is it a good idea to block the sale of AI military-grade technology? Maybe just get a quick yes or no?
Yes. Yes.
Everyone agrees. Okay, thank you.
All right. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from the great state of California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses here today. I really enjoyed your discussion and you brought up some very good points. Mr. Pillsbury, Dr. Pillsbury, I love what you said about coming up with a measure of our success or what we want to do when it comes to China. Because I think what my colleagues have said today, you know, banning sales to China, other actions, we do this, yet they seem to figure out how to get around these obstacles we put up all the time. And I would almost say in football terms, they're flooding the zone and we're chasing our own tail most of the time, not figuring it out. But actually the fact that we're chasing them is a major statement in of itself. So I'd love to have this Homeland Security come up with a, you know, lack of a better term, a subcommittee just to address the China issue and not just a hearing here and there. I can't help to think that a lot of these challenges we have are self-inflicted. Mr. Ivania, you're a former FBI agent. I would call you a patriot for all you've done. You probably could be making then, after 9/11, you could have been making more money in the private sector than you were in the FBI. My concern is the recent firings of FBI and CIA agents. Okay, a lot of you said that the issue here is personnel. They have more people dedicated to the mission than we do. Yet we just fired a bunch of people, which it sounds like they're going after them right now. China and Russia are trying to recruit them to get them to turn over information. Not only is the issue with those personnel that we fired, but what about the Iranians that are left in the agency? What effect does that have on their morale? Okay, you go into work, not on an hourly basis, you go into work for the mission. If you think you're gonna be fired, you're gonna be a person that's gonna be on the street tomorrow. Mr. Ivania, how would that affect your morale and your motivation to be the best?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I'm a big proponent of understanding and preventing the insider threat from being problematic, and whether it's in the government or the corporate world. From an intelligence perspective, the Communist Party of China and the Russian intelligence services, that's their job, is to come over here and go around the world and recruit disenfranchised employees, whether from the government or the corporate world, and identify them as being vulnerable and recruit them to facilitate either intelligence collection, selling secrets, or providing intellectual property trade secrets on the private sector side. So for me, this is a big issue because we have to be very conscious and effective as we are going to jettison federal employees who have access to critical information, whether it be analytics or secrets, and provide them an off-ramp to identify what those signs might look like if you are solicited or approached by a foreign intelligence service and or their proxy. So I'm concerned about the insider threat moving forward, both in the government and the corporate sector.
And I would argue that even the people that you fire, even if they're new to the job, these are tomorrow's experts on the subject matter. So they've gone through background checks, academic performances. They're some of the best we have in the US. You put them in, then you fire them. How does that bode for us 5, 10 years down the road when we're trying to still come up with the understanding, as Mr. Pillsbury said, of the mission that we're supposed to accomplish?
Well, as we've seen in history, the Communist Party of China and Russia will continue to try and place individuals into our apparatuses, the intelligence community, and with the government. And by doing that, they need the information intelligence of how do we operate from our application system, our background investigations, our polygraph. What does it look like in our training centers? What's the best and most effective way to get people placed in these organizations? So all those employees, whether they're probationary or whether they're new recruits or they're seasoned veterans, all have an impact on intelligence gathering of our adversaries.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time, but
15 seconds.
gentleman here came up with a great idea, which is to come up with a more focused approach on this issue moving forward, as opposed to a hearing on this on a random basis, so to speak.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good idea.
Time is
Gentleman's
up. I
time has
yield.
expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Pfluger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that that in this committee we can agree that if there's ways to more efficiently do business, that we can do that, and look forward to having that conversation about the folks who are not going to be a part of these agencies anymore. But getting to the heart of this matter, we do have good people working inside the agencies, and this has been an important issue. And without relitigating the last 4 years, let's start fresh here. And I'll start with Mr. Singleton talking about the Confucius Institutes, and I've had a lot of legislation on this, done a lot of work on Confucius Institutes. Very worried still that the Chinese Communist Party uses Confucius Institutes and other entities to hijack our intellectual property, to steal technologies, to do a variety of things that are detrimental to us. So what I'd like to ask you is, given the strategy of the military-civil fusion, what steps do you think the U.S. should be taking to prevent them from exploiting academic universities and using these CI kind of strategies?
Sure, no, thank you, sir, and thank you for your leadership on this issue, as well as the RSC that I know is taking a close look at this. Confucius Institutes used to number over about 120 across the United States. There are less than about 14 today, but they didn't actually go anywhere. They just rebranded and renamed themselves, and now they go by other names that are even harder to track. What's worse is we see the proliferation of these Chinese-controlled outreach programs at the K-12 level across the United States. Again, absolutely no coordination, control, or mandating requirement for any of these things. Beyond the concerns about free speech encroachment, beyond some of the ideological reservations we should have about what's being taught in these classrooms and to our students, there are real research risks, and primarily it's because when you open some of these or establish some of these research partnerships, and the academic exchanges, they all come together. So as we looked at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies at all of the Confucius Institute contracts, they mandate research partnerships in cutting-edge emerging fields, typically between Chinese universities supporting China's military and our university system. Beyond that, we have to be pretty concerned, I think, about free speech on campus. And there's ample evidence from the FBI and others showing that Confucius Institutes are used to suppress free speech and to organize protests against speakers, including the Dalai Lama, who come to U.S. universities to speak about human rights in China.
Thank you very much. Mr. Evening, I'll go to you on a similar topic, but on hybrid threats and the hybrid approach that the CCP takes to where they're blending, lawfare and legal and illicit activities together. So what are the concrete steps from your perspective that we can take to counter those?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. I think we have to first educate and advise and make everyone aware what that looks like. Whether or not you're in a university or research institute, or if you're a corporate world, they typically don't know what that hybrid threat looks like. What does it look like, whether it's a joint venture or it's an opportunity to go in a hybrid, influx some cash into a startup or a company in the Silicon Valley or Austin, Texas? There comes a tail to that. And I think we have to be more effective and efficient as a government entity, both the executive branch and Congress, in educating and informing how does that look like? How does it manifest with you and your dollars to be able to educate first and then mitigate second? Like the Confucius Institutes, the universities out there are just now starting to learn a lot of these partnerships with institutes in China are problematic. And we're starting to see onesie-twosies breaking those relationships.
So you mean they're taking advantage of our country, the Chinese Communist Party?
Count the ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we should be alert to the fact that they're...
And I do think we have to, but I think the onus is on the government to advise and inform universities and research institutions of what that looks like and be more effective.
Dr. Pillsbury, last 30 seconds to you. What keeps you up at night about the Chinese Communist Party taking advantage of our country?
Ooh, just to stick on this topic, the information collection from our universities is really quite dramatic. I first learned about this from FBI reports almost 15 years ago. They go into MIT or you name the high-tech university to the individual professors or department chairman, and they sign a right of first refusal. I give you $3 million. You tell me when you find me, the Chinese Communist Party, you tell me when you find something useful in your laboratory, and you show me first.
Wow.
These agreements were being signed by many universities. They did not know what it meant, and they didn't even consult with each other.
Should federal
So God bless
funding
the FBI.
Should federal funding be restricted from universities that are signing agreements?
Absolutely.
With us? Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes the representative from New Jersey, Ms. Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our ranking member, Thompson, for holding this important hearing. And thank you to each and every one of our witnesses for your testimony and providing us with a broad array of national security threat that we certainly understand we're facing from CCP. I thank you for your candid testimony and information. In my district, in northern New Jersey, I'm proud to represent a large and vibrant community of Ukrainian Americans, one of the biggest in our country. Just last week, I met with members of this community. The pain in the voices and faces of our community members were palatable. They stressed that in addition to being the right thing to do, U.S. support of Ukraine benefits our national security, with Ukraine serving as a barrier from Russia's further advancement into Europe. So I am deeply disturbed this week when I heard and saw that President Trump once ended critical military support to our allies in Ukraine. From weapons to satellite data, Ukrainians rely on our support to continue their fight, and we can't turn our backs on them now. So I'd like to begin, Mr. Doshi, if you would please. When the United States retreats from our partnership, how does that affect our ability to maintain relationships with other countries and a unified approach to countering China? How do we do that?
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. And let me start by saying that China is watching everything that we're doing on Ukraine very closely.
Indeed.
They would be very happy if in a fit of political dysfunction or capriciousness, we decided to cut aid to Ukraine because they think that means we won't aid Taiwan should that question be called. And so our activity on this issue has implications for how China looks at the Taiwan challenge. But the second part of this that I'd like to stress, Congresswoman, is also that the China challenge requires working with others. China is 35% of global manufacturing. We're less than 15%. They are 60% of global electric vehicle production, 70% of electric battery production, 50% of all robot installation, in the world. And so for us to be able to achieve scale, to compete with them, we have to do it together with others. And I do worry that some of our activity on Ukraine or some of our activity vis-a-vis Canada makes it harder for us to rally allies and partners to rise to the China challenge.
Yeah. Dr. Doshi, though, if you would also just talk about, if Europe no longer views the United States as a reliable ally, how does that create opening for China to exert its influence in Ukraine and elsewhere, anywhere else?
Well, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. I think that China has always been looking to split the U.S. and Europe. They understand, and everybody on this in this committee and everybody testifying today also knows that China wants to displace the U.S. as the world's leading power, but they can't do that without breaking the U.S. of its allies and partners. And the top of the list is Europe, Japan, and Korea. And so the more we have a wedge with our European friends, and we may have disagreements, but the stronger that wedge is, the more space there is for China, the easier it is for them to access European technology. Or take export controls. We need the Dutch, the Germans, and others to help us keep critical technology out of China. That's going to get harder and harder if the Europeans go their own way.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you so very much. Again, Chinese President Xi and Russian President Putin reaffirmed last week that their partnership has, quote, no limits. So, Dr. Doshi, and to the rest of our members, if we have the ability to respond, how might that partnership play out in terms of China's involvement in the Russian-Ukrainian war, and how does that harm America's national security?
Congresswoman, this is a very important issue. As in all the talk of a deal on Ukraine, we have to consider China. There is no successful Russian war effort in Ukraine without Chinese support for the Russian defense industrial base and Chinese transfer of lethal material to Russia. And so they are the arsenal of autocracy right now. And the fact that they're reiterating their no limits partnership at this moment is partially anxiety that we might pry them apart, but also a doubling down on the Russian war machine.
So I have 15 seconds. Mr. Singleton, did you wish to share your thoughts?
Sure, I would agree with what Rush said. It's time to impose costs on the Chinese Communist Party for aiding the Ukrainian war effort. They've gotten away with far too much for the last 4 years, and I think it's time to turn the tide.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chairman recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Brackeen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Singleton, you had something that you highlighted. I thought it was extremely succinct in your introduction, that the Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping talking about that the, quote, main battlefield is this innovation of technology. And then, Mr. Doshi, you talked about you highlighted yet again that as the United States is at 15% of global manufacturing, that China is at 35%. You said I heard another statistic a minute ago, so it was 30, so somewhere between 30 and 35%. I really want to just move to, the president has implemented this tariff. And you all are talking about, you've got some strong specifics, Mr. Singleton, where you talked about breaking that down and even more targeted things, sanctions, banning. I want to give you some time to build upon what the president is doing. We all look at things that, whether it's a tie or whether it's a coffee mug, and we're all shocked, made in China. And the president, knowing that economic strength is our national security, is trying to do a lot of things right now on the international front to change this. In addition to what Mr. Pillsbury talked about, which I think is just genius of Russ Vought at OMB, hopefully picking up that banner again and saying, what are we doing to help them, as if they have a $2 trillion gross domestic product, which they were, I guess, 20 and 30 years ago, and now they're clipping at 20 trillion gross domestic product, which somebody said is now 70% relative to our 29 trillion gross domestic product, and they're the highest GDP relative to the United States and the world, but we've empowered them because of all these goods that we're consuming. So how can we, I'll open this up to anybody, how can we take what the president is seeing clearly, tariffs and sanctions, and there will be a cost, but because of the danger, when he's saying this is the battlefield, he wants to play this game, he wants to take our technology, he wants to have the ability through Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, bring our electric grid down, bring our water systems down, military installation, ownership of farmland. How can we build public sentiment to bolster our president, for the American populace to say we may have to pay a price because this is a real threat. Whoever wants to take that.
I'll start, but welcome others as well. I mean, I think tariffs are really important tools of geopolitical leverage if used correctly. In the case of China, amidst its economic slowdown, tariffs, unlike sanctions, they bite overnight. They cut deep. And right now, China's economy is facing tremendous headwinds, reliant almost exclusively on overcapacity in its export model, which makes it ripe for sort of sharp targeted vulnerability in terms of using tariffs. I think we can use tariffs to actually change Chinese behavior beyond its non-market practices. Fentanyl is a great example, and I think the president is employing tariffs in that way as a pressure tactic to achieve changes in Chinese behavior. I think Bill mentioned it best. We need a whole of country sort of approach to this, and part of that is building out different pillars of economic statecraft: sanctions, outbound investment screening, sectoral export control bans to prevent the flow of these technologies into China's military and its defense sector, and all of the sort of pillars of American economic power working together towards a desired end state, which I hope we would all believe is a change in Chinese behavior.
Can we do something to build upon more targeted tariff percentages? I mean, are there ways to be targeted in the way we're doing reprisal tariffs that could, I mean, this is a gross domestic product that is gained at a rapid pace in the last 20 years ago. No one saw China coming like this 20 years ago. I see a lot of head nodding on the panel.
Congressman, two quick thoughts. First, the administration is rightly considering what are called component tariffs that would make it harder for China to kind of hide rules of, behind rules of origin. This would allow us to go after the fact that Chinese chips might be in something bigger that we buy from another country. It allows us to carve them out of supply chains. The second point, Mr. Chairman, Congressman, is actually a critical one. The Trump administration in the first term had something, an executive order, ICTS executive order. It's a regulatory barrier. It allows us to keep goods out with a regulatory ban on them. That tool should be expanded. That executive order could be codified by Congress. It was something the Biden administration used, and we could keep using it.
Congressman, if I may, I just want to amplify both those comments by saying a little bit different perspective about amplifying the message and the why matters. And I think when we talk about tariffs and economic drivers, I think we have to message the American people why this all matters. Because in our generation, we look at it culturally, the Russians, the Cold War, they were bad. We beat them in 1980 in the Olympics, right? We had the Ayatollah in 1979. The Iranians culturally were bad. We have not had that with the Chinese Communist Party yet. So culturally across our country, and I'll proffer to you in Oklahoma, our constituents don't see China in the same light as we saw Iran and Russia. And I think we have to do a better job, more effective at driving the issues as why this stuff matters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair recognizes Ms. McIver.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to my ranking member, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Under the pretense of promoting efficiency, Elon Musk's Doge team has acquired unmatched control over critical government databases and technology systems. These systems house sensitive information, including private data on federal employees, government contracts, regulatory investigations, and even the personal information of everyday citizens. Equally concerning are Musk's close ties with China and his boundless access to and influence over U.S. government agencies and systems. These dynamics raise serious questions about national security, data privacy, and the integrity of our federal operations. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today as we work to ensure transparency, accountability, and the protection of American interests. With that, I have one question for each witness. The intelligence community's 2024 worldwide threat assessment highlights China as the most active cyber threat. How might the Trump administration's reduction in CISA personnel affect the nation's ability to defend against these threats? Mr. Doshi, Dr. Doshi, you can start.
Sure, thank you, Congresswoman. It's an important question. And what I'll say is that, as I mentioned, China invests heavily in personnel for offense and defense. And that gives them significant advantage. They've got 1.4 billion people, we have 350 million. And labor does matter in this business. What I'd like to see is us increase our federal workforce when it comes to cyber, both offense and defense. And right now, I do worry that the cuts are coming at the wrong time. Right now, we're learning about Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, compromise of critical infrastructure, telecom. Every single day there's something new. We need to be scaling up, not scaling down, and that's what I worry about.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Doshi. Mr. Singleton?
I think it's important that we have the right personnel in place, and I'm not an expert on CISA or the reductions in force there, but I actually think that we also need to be thinking about building up that tech talent workforce in the private sector as well. And I think this is where Congress has a really important role to play, both to incentivize private companies to hire and invest and train their own talent workforce, but to think about how we want to maybe not rely so much on the federal government to solve all these problems, but look to the private sector to do the work for us.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in?
I would amplify that in respect with, I don't have any fidelity on the cuts per se of what you referenced, but I do say that I put most emphasis on our ability or inability to protect from the Communist Party of China in our private sector, in Wall Street, in telecommunications, in energy, academia. We need to be more effective and efficient at how we drive protection measures out there, which is the main battlefield for Xi Jinping, versus be so concerned about personnel in the government.
Well, you can't do that without people. Dr. Pillsbury?
Yeah, I agree with you. And the Homeland Security assessment you mentioned, I believe from committee staff, is manned by 800 people. And I agree with you that there's actually 3 sentences in the assessment that say China is the greatest threat. But the bulk of the work is not China. It's all kinds of other threats. So looking at personnel issues, I just wonder if the committee could write a letter to that unit and say, why do you have 800 people? How many are working on China, the main threat, you say yourselves, versus other things? But personnel is very, very important. That's why I was advocating we need some kind of new unit in our government that keeps track of the competition with China. We don't have it now in any department.
Thank you so much for that. I agree. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Joe Lay yields back. The Joe Lay from South Carolina, Ms. Biggs, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The digital age has illuminated our world with unprecedented connection, fueling American prosperity and transforming our very way of life. This very connectedness has also cast long shadows, revealing vulnerabilities that our adversaries, most notably the People's Republic of China, are determined to exploit. For too long, we have witnessed their calculated and often aggressive drive to seize control of critical technologies, especially within the vital arteries of our telecommunications sector. The insidious and encroaching influence of the Chinese state-owned telecom enterprise Huawei over global 5G infrastructure is not merely a business concern, it is a direct assault on our national sovereignty. Their control over these networks creates the potential for digital backdoors, a silent invasion of our communications networks, a potential weapon against the very fabric of our free society. Furthermore, Huawei controls approximately 30% of the global telecommunications market and is the dominant telecommunications provider in many countries, acting as an arm of the Chinese Communist Party. This market dominance creates a dangerous scenario where unchecked growth equates to increased opportunities for Chinese espionage. Imagine a scenario where sensitive government communications, critical infrastructure control systems, or even personal data are compromised through these digital backdoors. As we have learned today, represented by events like these outlined in our witnesses' testimonies, this threat is a stark reality. The potential for compromise is not merely theoretical, but a documented capability, a chilling testament to the danger posed by unchecked access to our vital communications networks. So my question is to Mr. Singleton. Is it fair to say that we are now in global arms race with China over control of telecommunications infrastructure?
No, thank you for the question. I absolutely believe we're in a global arms race with China as it relates to emerging technologies, but particularly telecommunications. As a result of the tremendous work done by this committee, the Biden administration, and the Trump administration, Huawei is down, but it's certainly not out. I think even just last week, the CEO of Huawei sat front and center in a meeting with Chairman Xi Jinping in Beijing to talk about China's role in emerging technologies. I think that right alone is a signal of positional power for Huawei and the important role Huawei plays in China's industrial policies. I think, to borrow a phrase from the Biden administration, I think there's both promote opportunities and protect opportunities here. We really need to be thinking about Western coalitions of telecommunications companies that can provide alternative telecommunications gear and systems to both countries here but abroad, but also enhanced export controls, particularly through acts like the Enforce Act to cut off Huawei from advanced semiconductors, AI equipment. I think that dual approach is actually what's going to be needed here to protect communication systems going forward.
Do you agree that the United States has a national security interest in ensuring that the global telecommunications core infrastructure is not controlled by a hostile state actor like Huawei?
I think it's probably the defining challenge of the 21st century is going to be figuring out who controls the means of communication, whether it's TikTok, whether it's telecommunications networks, whether it's basic standards for emerging technologies. That will probably be the defining challenge, and whoever wins will control the drivers of the 21st century industrial revolution.
And just one more thing. So in your professional opinion, what do you think the new Trump administration, what could we do about that?
Rush mentioned codifying OICTS. I think that's a tremendous move. The America First investment policy that the White House released about 2 weeks ago was a tremendous roadmap and offered so much opportunity for Congress to be thinking through codifying through law steps, whether it's outbound investment screening, enhanced export controls, severing China's ability to make greenfield investments in the United States, to purchase farmland. I think it was the roadmap that Congress could follow, and I think there would be tremendous bipartisan support for nearly every single one of the measures in that policy.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
JLA yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thanadar. Hope I got that right.
Yeah, you did great. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. And thank you for our distinguished panel here for coming and expressing your views and opinions. So the CCP has been seeking to exploit American openness in order to steal economic secrets and undermine our national security. I'm particularly concerned about the access currently President Trump and Elon Musk have given to DOGE unfettered access to sensitive information systems containing information about the inner workings of the federal government and millions of Americans, a lot of privacy data of many Americans they have access to. I believe they are young 19, 20-year-old who have not been vetted or has gone any kind of security or screening. So it is unclear whether or how this information that is given to DOGE is being safeguarded. And how would we ensure that such information doesn't fall into the hands of our adversaries like China, which is particularly troubling given Elon Musk's close ties with China, his many business ventures in China. What kind of a firewall there is to protect the information that's been freely flowing to the DOGE. And specifically, I think I want to ask Dr. Doshi, can you explain how China's access to this sensitive information, information about American citizens? You know, I've been having town halls in Michigan, talking to, hundreds of my constituents, and they're very concerned about their private data, their social security numbers, their buying habits, whatever information that they have. falling into the wrong hands. They're already concerned about that information being freely given to DOJ, and now we don't know where else it's going. So how would that impact our U.S. security from your viewpoint?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for the question. I'll start by saying this. China is the most formidable cyber actor the U.S. faces, bar none. It's the most formidable. It has mounted a multi-decade campaign to steal our personal data for counterintelligence purposes successfully, our intellectual property, as we've discussed, again, quite successfully, they're still doing it, and to penetrate our critical infrastructure to cause us harm. And so when we think about the situation we're in now, the U.S. government has already been compromised multiple times. I do worry, though, that if we move fast and break things in some of these systems, it's possible we're giving adversaries additional vectors to compromise additional information. And I think Americans understand the China challenge in abstract, as members of this committee know well. It's also useful to make it concrete to them. The concrete risk here is that cyber actors will have their personal data and use it potentially down the road, especially if they're members of law enforcement or members of the government, federal government, for blackmail purposes. And that's something we want to avoid.
Well, what can we do, and this is for anybody on the panel, what can we do to use technology to safeguard this data that we have? I know blockchain technology has been used in the crypto markets, but that technology has wide applications outside of the crypto industry. Can such a technology be used to safeguard some of the data?
Well, I'll start really quickly with just one or two ideas. I think technology is partly the solution to the problem that we have. Regulation is some of it, personnel is some of it, tech is part of it too, in three dimensions. First, we should use better encrypted communications at the federal level. We are not really up to speed on that. Second, we should make sure that the vendors we rely on, like Microsoft and Amazon, are not doing business in China in ways that undermine the security of the products that the federal government uses. And then I think, third of all, we have to seriously consider moving certain communications to classified spaces.
All right, thank you so much. My time is almost up, so I yield.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. McKenzie, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our panelists today. An incredibly important topic that we're discussing here, the threat posed by Chinese Communist Party to the U.S. and our national security. We've talked about a lot of important issues, the cyber intrusions into critical infrastructure, the pernicious use of social media, and also the work that the party, the Communist Party of China, is doing to embed themselves into America's education system. One thing that I would like to talk about and focus on that I don't think we've maybe hit on enough here today is the defense industry for America and what the Chinese Communist Party is potentially doing to target our contractors and those in the defense industry. We heard a little bit earlier about the theft of intellectual property, but what I have seen is that the Communist Party of China is investing in certain companies that seem to me to be strategic investments in sometimes parent companies, where then the subsidiaries or part companies of those larger entities are actually providing defense investment and equipment and technology for our U.S. military. So I would like to hear from any of the panelists if they have seen this kind of activity and what their thoughts are on what we should be doing to address it.
Congressman, thanks for that question. I think that's a very deep and introspective question about the commonplace and the tactics of the Communist Party have used, not only in a corporate sector, but in defense industrial base. I think the way you laid out that scenario is commonplace. And I think if you see one example of that, whether it be subsidiary, a supply chain vendor, you're going to see that 1,000 times across. It's true to their form, how they do it, how they penetrate, how they facilitate, they get access, whether it be architectural plans or just access to an IT system. It's commonplace. I think with respect to understanding how that works, how does it manifest, we have to be more effective and efficient with their defense industrial base, big companies, and have them force similar cyber hygiene practices all the way down through their supply chain to be able to prevent that from happening again and again. We just saw recently some cases in the news where you had small vendors who were supplying critical technologies to defense industrial base who were being owned and operated by a Communist Party of China personnel. That's simple due diligence we could be more effective and efficient at defeating.
I'll try to get to you, Congressman McKenzie, a couple of things. One is a copy of President Trump's book in 2015 when he laid out the sophistication that he had observed with Chinese companies. They don't always give their real names when they come shopping for things in our country. Secondly, there's a young scholar at SAIS here in town who's just finished a book. I heard the briefing on it. The Chinese often have 5 or 6 layers of institutions, legal entities. It could be in the Bahamas or it could be in Malta. And when they do cyber espionage or when they buy and sell American companies, they can hide behind these 5 or 6 layers. So this young scholar is trying to see how many of these layers can be detected through our own cyber operations. But the issue in he wasn't president then, but the issue in his book, Great Again, was just how sophisticated the Chinese are. From his own, he tells stories of his own efforts to have Trump company products made in China. He doesn't say it, but I think he lost money. He doesn't like that kind of thing.
I would just add that sometimes people are the problem. It's pretty concerning that there's a lack of post-employment restrictions on DoD and IC officials. They can go work for Chinese companies and maintain their security clearances after employment. They can lobby on behalf of Chinese companies or companies that have major investments in China. That's totally permissible and allowed today. I'd argue this is probably an opportunity for legislation to come up with post-employment restrictions, a real review on security clearances, and maybe you shouldn't be able to hold a security clearance and then benefit from that security clearance while you represent or advance a Chinese company's interests.
And Congressman, I'd just add, if I may, maybe 3 quick things. First, beneficial ownership knowledge is important for law enforcement. There's a Corporate Transparency Act could help us get at their shell companies that are acquiring parts of our defense industrial base. Second, on the cyber side, there's a lot more that we need to hold our companies to do in contracting. And finally, CFIUS is a tool that we need to expand for this purpose, particularly with venture.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of the panelists for that information and suggestions that they offered because, again, I've seen this myself in several instances, and I find it very concerning. And so I think that we should be doing more to address this across the entire spectrum of America's economy, but particularly when it comes to the defense industry. So just want to thank all of you again for joining us today and for your responses. I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner.
Thank you, Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Thompson. Before I begin, I just want to recognize the empty chair on the dais and offer my condolences to the family, the friends, and the constituents of Congressman Turner. Although we were only colleagues here on the committee for a short time, I know that he left a legacy of a lifetime of public service and impact in his home city of Houston, and our thoughts and prayers are with him and his family today. On the topic of today's hearing, the Chinese authoritarian government continues to launch aggressive attacks against the United States, including but not limited to offensive cyber operations targeting critical infrastructure, transnational repression, industrial espionage, and more. The CCP has worked to infiltrate our most sensitive sectors, including the energy grid and our communications networks, creating high-risk vulnerabilities in a time of crisis. These cyber attacks against the United States also include the illegal pursuit and theft of American intellectual property, the theft of trade secrets through industrial espionage, coercion, or joint ventures poses a serious threat to the U.S. economy, erodes our competitiveness, and most importantly, costs Americans jobs. China's theft of our intellectual property has been allowed to undercut American businesses, impacting our workforce, and undermining our national defense. The Chinese government also continues to suppress dissent outside of its borders through a range of coercive tactics, including surveillance, harassment, and even violence. The CCP's long arm of repression has real implications for the fundamental freedoms and human rights that we uphold as a nation. Unfortunately, the Trump administration continues to strengthen China by insulting our allies, undermining NATO, launching expensive trade wars against Mexico and Canada, and now other American allies, and surrendering the developing world to China by shutting down U.S. aid. Donald Trump and Elon Musk's destructive elimination of U.S. aid is not only creating a series of humanitarian crises, it plays right into the hands of the CCP, driving strategically important countries away from the United States and into the waiting arms of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Similarly, Trump and Musk's shameful cuts to our national security and cybersecurity agencies makes us less safe. They have made reckless personnel cuts and pressured public servants to resign at CISA, the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and the Defense Department. All of these agencies and departments are critical for protecting Americans against CCP aggression, preventing cyber attacks and attacks on our infrastructure, and holding Chinese agents in the United States accountable. Dr. Doshi, can you comment on the importance of American soft power and the importance of maintaining relationships, particularly in the developing world, in this global contest that we have with the CCP, and the dangers that come from repelling those nations away from the United States and into the waiting arms of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. I'll answer in two respects. First, I'll talk a little bit about, I think, the global south, if you will, and then maybe the rest of our allies and partners. On the global south portion, China has learned from the first trade war. What they're trying to do now is do better in the second potential coming trade war by relying more on exports to developing countries than to the United States and the West. So they're relying more on Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and other parts of the world to import their goods. Now, that's a challenge for us, because if we want to be able to really bring leverage to bear, we don't want them to be able to find market share elsewhere around the world. So how do we stop that? Well, we have to be players in the developing world. We have to either bring aid or tie that aid sometimes to vendors implicitly. We have to make sure that we're active. And it is possible that some of these cuts in some of these places can undermine some of those efforts.
Yeah. If I could, just because I don't have a lot of time left, I want to give an example just to illustrate this for my colleagues here and for anyone who is listening. I have a factory in my district that makes a peanut paste called Plumpy Nut. It's used to save the lives of children who are starving. It's a high-protein paste. They received a stop work order from Doge, from Elon Musk. Their contracts were canceled. A month later, finally, as children were dying around the world, their contract was restored, but they still have not been paid yet. They are owed millions of dollars. Meanwhile, we are relying on the developing world for critical minerals, for intelligence gathering, for trade, in competition with China, and we are letting their kids starve because some kid behind a computer screen here in Washington is cutting off life-saving aid, shooting ourselves in the foot, and strengthening our adversary, China. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just take a moment to offer condolences and thoughts and prayers to the Turner family. Again, briefly, our colleague, but a gentle soul and a kind man, and he will be missed. Mr. Pillsbury, you co-edited the Heritage Foundation's report, Winning the New Cold War, a Plan for Countering China. It notes that there is growing evidence that Beijing is co-opting divisive ESG and DEI initiatives to undermine U.S. competitiveness. What do you believe are the implications of those efforts?
Well, they're very scary. If they succeed, we lose our global primacy. We lose all the benefits of being the world leader, and I doubt that we can get it back.
Well, you hit on an important point. I think sometimes we get distracted with the media cycle and perhaps what's going on the European continent, which is important, of course. But when we look at the existential threats to the United States and our supremacy globally, whether that's militarily or economically speaking, would it be fair to say, or at least it's my assessment, that China would be the adversary that we should be most concerned about? Your thoughts?
Yes, I think so. And the good news I've just learned in the past hour at this hearing is that having lost the election, the Democrats now seem to have a new theme, which I had not heard before. We Democrats are tougher on China than you Republicans. Now, there's a defense, I'm sure, but the fact that this is an issue to attack Republicans really shows we have some hope for our country, that we're going to have a bipartisan approach.
It's now a bipartisan issue, right? Well, I mean, but again, I want to focus on this issue. So, we talked about, you hear about the Belt and Road Initiative on investment in foreign countries and how China is, quite frankly, co-opting governments around the world with their Belt and Road Initiative. And yet some of the foreign aid that is being griped about, that's being cut, is for gender fluidity in some far-flung crap hole country that nobody cares about. And quite frankly, they're offended that we're there. And so as we start to prioritize where we're spending our money, I think we think about Homeland Security. We think about our lethality. We think about our dominance in the economic and military sectors. And so, but I want to get back to China and DEI. While the Chinese Communist Party delights in the spread of ideologies like DEI, they weaponize it against us, it throws it in our faces. We can't forget how they opened their engagement with the last administration by grandstanding about the Black Lives Matter movement at a meeting with Secretary Blinken in Alaska. Meanwhile, the CCP is literally cutting the organs out of the Falun Gong practitioners. They have concentration camps for the Uyghurs and other religious minorities. And after they kidnap and abuse Uyghur men, they send CCP officials to their homes to rape their wives and make their children sit with them for dinner and call them dad. They demonically call this the Pair Up and Become Family program. The CCP's wickedness is hard to fathom. Mr. Pillsbury, your written testimony encourages us to expose China's corruption, censorship. You specifically mentioned a Bloomberg News article about the Xi Jinping's family's wealth. Why do you think the CCP is so sensitive about the wealth of its leadership?
What I advocate in my testimony has to do with the ruthless nature of power politics at the top in China. We know this from a lot of disclosures that happen after somebody gets killed, or in one case, when Kissinger was making his second visit, October 71, a large number of generals and senior officials had been executed or put in prison, and we did not know about it. This continually happens. There's a book last year by a British diplomat named Roger Garside called Coup d'etat. He implies that the current prime minister of China could launch a coup against Xi Jinping, and he even opens the book with how that might happen. Now, the prime minister suddenly found himself out and dead of a heart attack. But high-level politics in Beijing, we have to keep track of it, and we have to know what is going on that affects our interests. This is one of the things I advocate. And I got this idea, frankly, from President Trump, who once raised the issue, our politics is in the newspapers every day. Can someone tell me about what Xi Jinping is worried about? And it's very hard to do that. We need to spend more time on it.
Yes, sir. And Mr. Chairman, I just want to say, as we look to our homeland, as we look to our initiatives abroad, we have to think in terms of what's in it for us. So whether it's the minerals deal in Ukraine, whether it's deals and programs in Latin America or South and Central America or Africa, we've got to put America first. We need to support our president and put our country first. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for having this important hearing, and also thank you for acknowledging the loss of our colleague, Mayor and Representative Turner. We're going to miss him and his spirit. On this topic, I actually don't disagree much with what my colleague from Tennessee just mentioned. I want to ask the witnesses here, as it relates to China, do you agree that unlike almost any intelligence service in the world, including ours, that they task their intelligence service to steal intellectual property to benefit Chinese businesses? Is there anyone here that disagrees with that? Does everyone?
I would just add one thing.
Yeah.
I think they're almost unique in the world in tasking the MSS to do this. Most intelligence services in the world are spying on government secrets, not trying to build up the national champions. So in many ways, we can tip our hat that the Chinese intelligence service is working for the national champions, unlike the world's other intelligence services.
But I don't think you're suggesting that, like, the CIA should be stealing secrets to help Cisco.
I think they would resign.
Yeah. So Does everyone here agree that our greatest economic foe in the world is China? I think there's agreement here. Just by a show of hands, who here would support defending Taiwan militarily if China militarily invaded Taiwan? So would I, and so would a lot of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And I raise that because my colleague from Tennessee also referenced Ukraine and the minerals deal there. And what concerns me about the state of play in Ukraine on this very important topic is that if you are Taiwan right now, you should be very worried about us possibly leaving our friends in the field in Ukraine. And if you're Taiwan, you're probably asking yourself, could the United States stitch together an alliance to actually defend us? Because if China were to militarily invade Taiwan, sure, it's in our interest to defend Taiwan. Maybe there's a couple other countries in the region who may have an interest. I don't know why Europe would want to get involved unless it was strong American partnership and strength and allyship that persuaded them to do that. And so, to my Republican colleagues, I guess I just warn that we can't be tough on China but soft on Russia, because China won't believe us. They will actually think that we wouldn't really honor our commitment to Taiwan and that the rest of the world wouldn't go with us because we would have a credibility deficit on that issue. As it relates to Ukraine, I also just want to note that the return on investment is probably the greatest military return on investment the United States has ever spent. I don't want to discount how much money we have spent. It's a lot. But most of the money has gone to factories in Texas and Ohio to create American jobs, benefiting American companies. And the number of soldiers lost is 0. So you could say the return on investment is infinity because you cannot divide 0. So these two issues are directly related, and I hope we don't separate them, because I want to be tough on China and tough on Russia, and I'm afraid you can't be tough on one and soft on the other. Mr. Doshi, what is the state of play right now as it relates to Chinese, whether it's state-sponsored or individuals that they harbor in their country, as far as cyber attacks that are not just stealing intellectual theft, but also ransomware or phishing or denial of service attacks on U.S. companies?
Well, thank you, Congressman. In the last decade, China's become the world's most capable cyber actor. I think you could argue before that it was Russia. Now it's definitely China. When it comes to taking American personal data, intellectual property, or pre-positioning for cyber attack with web shells or living off the land techniques, they're at the state of the art, and they're investing more resources, more staff, and more personnel to be the best at it.
And really quickly, Russia obviously has a lot of independent cyber actors who are just financially benefiting themselves. What, inside China, would you have the temerity as an independent actor not associated with the government to attack the U.S.? I don't hear much about like that environment.
Very quickly, China has a number of independent cyber actors, but they usually are contracted by the government. They don't usually go rogue on their own.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
When yields, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ranking member, thank you, of course, to the witnesses for taking your time to come and have this important conversation with us today. I spent 22 years in the military and law enforcement, 12 years U.S. Army, another 10 years as a local police officer. And the district that I represent is really an intersection of a lot of things that are critical both in that public safety space and that national defense space, particularly, and we'll start off the conversation with critical infrastructure like energy. I represent the 4th highest energy producing county in the nation: oil, gas, wind, solar, geothermal. We got nuclear fuel rods in the district. And so the first question to Mr. Evanina is, we know that the CCP is engaged pretty heavily in cyber espionage and attacks on critical infrastructure. Can you comment on how we're currently postured to be able to defend against those attacks and what the roadmap going forward looks like to be able to protect our critical infrastructure and energy production?
Congressman, thanks for the question, and I concur with your assessment of Colorado. Back in 2017 and 18, when I was director of the National Counterintelligence Security Center, we identified Colorado as not necessarily phase line 0, but a critical element, specifically the I-25 corridor. What we saw as this is going to be a perfect example, a roadmap for how China is attacking our critical infrastructure from north to south in Colorado because of those critical entities you referenced. And we said, because they're doing this here in Colorado, we are now going to map that across our nation, because what China does very well is mimic their successes. Because they were successful in Colorado, we said, let's look at how they're doing this across the ecosystem, whether it be in Austin, Texas, California, Boston, and we saw the same type of activities in critical infrastructure that we saw in Colorado. Second part is, I think we have to be more effective and efficient in making aware how this threat manifests in critical infrastructure. As you know, 85 to 90% of the critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. They don't get that top secret intelligence or critical intelligence. We need to be more effective in declassifying and getting known and collected intelligence from the CIA, NSA, and FBI to those people who own the critical infrastructure so they can create and mitigate some of the cyber activities they see in their networks.
Thank you for that. And then kind of pivoting off of that topic, still around critical infrastructure, Mr. Singleton, we know that one of the key challenges that's facing us is just the ability to build that critical infrastructure, to have that manufacturing base, and to have those supply chains protected with sources that are not controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And so again, for my district being very energy heavy, one of the big concerns that we have is if we don't have the energy to actually be able to fuel and provide for American manufacturing and American infrastructure in the United States, well, we know that China does not have anywhere near the environmental regulations that we have, and they're bringing on just an incredible number of coal-fired plants using slave labor and outright terrible methods to be able to fuel their grid. Can you just comment on what we need to be able to do in the United States, particularly in the energy generation space, to make sure that we have sufficient energy to be able to compete with the Chinese Communist Party and their absolute disregard for the environment and how they fuel their grid?
No, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I mean, I don't think we can be our own worst enemy here. I think that we've unfortunately taken a number of steps to make it very difficult to even mine or certainly process rare earth materials here in the United States. Until we work through some of those regulations, I would say we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back. Mineral stockpiling may be a solution there, but I think there's a lot of work to be done on Congress to get there. I think ultimately we're going to have to be incentivizing and thinking about select investments in new energy systems and structures and companies to help scale them, and working with partners and allies. I think we've all mentioned here that the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians, certainly companies here in the United States, all want to work together to build out this safe, secure ecosystem of energy systems and structures. We should be incentivizing that. I think we can lead there. And it's an area where we can actually diffuse some of the costs among our closest allies, where we can actually share some of the sensitive information that goes into those types of systems.
In my remaining 30 seconds, just around batteries, we have an incredible reliance on batteries and the battery supply, the battery supply chains. Can you comment on how we can better protect our battery production and storage systems here in the United States?
China is a champion in battery energy storage solutions. These companies, particularly CATL, are mainlined into our electrical grid today across the United States, and the number of partnerships between CATL and U.S. utilities is only increasing. This is insanity, not just because CATL is ostensibly private but responsible to reporting to the Chinese government, but because, as we've talked about today, they serve as vectors into our critical infrastructure and supply chains for cyber attacks and espionage.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'm very glad we are having this hearing. And once again, I note the complete disconnect between this hearing and its purpose and what the Trump administration is doing. Absolutely, we need to address China and do it on all fronts: cyber, economic, military, diplomatic, in all ways. But when the CIA sends an unclassified email to the White House listing names of employees hired over the last 2 years, including a number of China-focused analysts whose identities, of course, are heavily guarded from Chinese hacks, that compromises significantly our ability to conduct intelligence, gather intelligence, and push back against China. Mr. Evanina, I know you were the director of the National Counterintelligence, NCSC, I forget what it's called, but the notion that probationary employees are somehow disposable seems to me at least to fly in the face of how our intelligence community works. Because am I correct that in those early years you often have extensive language training and extensive additional training to prepare you to go out in the field and successfully execute your job? Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, Congressman.
And, you know, I know Director Burns recently, when he took over at the agency, really tried to beef up hires related to China and those who speak some of the Chinese languages. He actually increased the agency's budget from 9% devoted to China-related analysis and espionage to what it is today, which is closer to 20%. And so, am I correct, Mr. Evanina, that if an unclassified document is sent to the White House that includes the actual names of CIA employees, that significantly jeopardizes their ability to continue to do the clandestine intelligence work that they're charged with doing? Is that accurate?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with the fidelity of that issue, but if it's an unclassified report of individuals who are undercover, who have a cover on them, and it's provided in the wrong hands of the White House, those who don't need to know, it could potentially cause problems, yes.
Right, and of course we know, and I think you said in your opening statement, that China's hacking of Americans' personal data is widespread and extensive. I believe you said there are 50% of Americans have had personal data stolen by the CCP. And so what does that mean for the possibility that unvetted non-government officials can get access to every single American's personal identification information through the Treasury Department of the Social Security Administration and potentially place it on unclassified servers? Does that expose Americans' personal identification information to China's hacking and cyber warfare efforts?
Obviously in that situation, but I would proffer, Congressman, as I referenced, almost every American has had all their personal identified information already taken by the Chinese. I think the concern you reference is hypothetically if those is merged with individuals who are potentially undercover and matching person A with that data.
Right, and I think that's incredibly important. And so the notion that we're having this hearing and talking about beefing up our efforts to address China, to countering threats posed by the CCP, and I want to be clear, when we say China, I mean the CCP, to our national security, and yet what the Trump administration, what Elon Musk are doing is undermining those efforts. In fact, there's reporting even that some of the people who have been fired with security clearances or probationary employees are now being recruited by Russia and China to be agents themselves. And we know about Elon Musk's significant conflicts of interest in China with his own businesses, and part of which maybe have influenced his opposition to the budget bill that we agreed in a bipartisan way to pass in December. And so, Mr. Chairman, I would just urge you and your colleagues on the other side of the aisle to take this focus and this concern and bring it to the administration so that they can join you in bolstering these efforts rather than undermining them. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. That concludes this hearing, and I'd like to enter into the record the closing statement by Chairman Mark Green, who is sick today. We hope he gets better. I just want to give a few closing remarks, but if the ranking member has, let me recognize the ranking member.
Thank you. Let me thank our witnesses for their excellent testimony. And obviously, you will probably see some of it in written form shared other places, but for all the right reasons, we have to protect our country. And I don't think there's any real difference on the committee as who the real enemy is. I think there's some question as to how we should protect it, but I'm convinced that we'll do that. Mr. Chair, I want to enter into the record part of what Mr. Goldman was saying, a story sharing that Russia and China both are attempting to recruit disgruntled federal employees for their own benefit.
Without objection, so ordered.
In addition to that, I want to enter into the record the fact that an unclassified email with names of some employees in the Trump administration was sent to the White House.
And without objection, so ordered.
What we heard today is that China's ambition to shift international order and their capability to do is real. While Acting Chairman Guest recognized that countering threats from the CCP will also take economic and diplomatic investment, the administration's actions run counter to that statement. Just today, in response to the Trump administration's recent actions, the Chinese embassy in the U.S. tweeted, "If war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we are ready to fight till the end." In a war, a nation needs allies and assets. This administration is sidelining our friends, NATO, as well as Ukraine, while appeasing Russia. The administration is cutting the cyber workforce that protects our networks, undermining our intelligence capabilities, and weakening our relations around the world. The administration's approach does not make sense. The administration is leading us into a fight with China with a misguided foreign policy, a misguided trade policy, a misguided cyber policy, a misguided intelligence policy, and a misguided economic policy. Instead, we must maintain our tried and true alliances and posture the U.S. to defend against threats both foreign and domestic. I urge our Republican colleagues to step up and hold the Trump administration accountable. I thank, again, the witnesses for their testimony and yield back.
Ranking member yields. Let me, in closing, say it's been a great hearing. I think, as Dr. Pillsbury said, this is a bipartisan issue. It's a threat to the United States, and as Americans, we unite as Republicans and Democrats. I also just want to make a few comments on the threat landscape as I see it. As both the chairman emeritus of this committee and Foreign Affairs, the threat after the fall of Afghanistan, the invasion of Ukraine, then the Ayatollah rearing his ugly head in the Middle East, but the unholy alliance between Putin and Chairman Xi at the Beijing Olympics prior to the invasion of Ukraine is, I find, deeply disturbing. I think, as Dr. Doshi mentioned, the Chinese have completely revitalized the Russian military. Iran has sent drones that Russia uses to kill Ukrainians, the same drones that they use to fire into Israel. However, I do see normalization in the Middle East. Being the eternal optimist, I do see the conflict in Eastern Europe, I hope, being resolved. It's a threat to the Indo-Pacific that I find the most serious within the context of the great power competition, but also someone who's traveled to Taiwan and been surrounded on the island by war games exercises conducted by the CCP. In a direct shot across the bow, not only to me, but to the recently inaugurated President Lai, As someone who flew over the South China Sea, seeing Chinese warships invading Philippine waters with water cannons hitting vessels in the Philippines, warning us that we are invading Chinese sovereign territory. It's getting very aggressive, which is why I passed the AUKUS bill to the Alliance of the United States, Australia, and the UK to further not only submarine warfare, but also Pillar 2, which is AI quantum innovation when it comes to weapon systems, which is why I think, again, going back to this export control issue on chips is important. I think an invasion of Taiwan would be catastrophic. Either China would own or break TSMC, which I've traveled to and have seen. You mentioned ASML's machines, very important that they not sell those to China, but the result there is I was told by TSMC would be a complete shutdown of 90% of the advanced global manufacturing, which is precisely why I introduced the CHIPS Act. Under the guidance of Mike Pompeo, then Secretary of State under President Trump, so there's no confusion about this program, which was designed to pull supply chain out of Taiwan and invest it in the United States. TSMC just announced a $100 billion investment in the United States, which is a good thing. And we've had $650 billion reinvested for the purpose of manufacturing this critical asset here in the United States. And I want to leave you with two other thoughts that have not come up, and that is I visited with Merrick Garland, being in the Brotherhood of the DOJ, and talked to him about the China task force being shut down, even though espionage has not. This united front, someone who worked in this area many years ago, concerns me as a 501c3 political arm of the CCP in the United States. And also something that was brought to my attention by Palmer Luckey, who runs Anduril, that does a lot of great innovation like the Ghost Shark, which will be used extensively in the Pacific, talked about our patent system being open to the public and how China, for them, it's a treasure trove of documents that they can look at on a daily basis and steal patents from the United States. Finally, capital flows. You know, I introduced a bill last Congress. I know the administration has come out with their own guidance and executive order on restriction of capital flows that then basically go into arming the PLA's war machine. So I leave you with those thoughts in conclusion. I invite you to provide further testimony on those points. And finally, to the point that Dr. Pillsbury raised, and that is the role of this committee, when you have all these employees over there at the Department of Homeland, how many are really working on China? And in my view, it should be the highest priority. So any guidance you have to this committee in terms of what the ranking member and the chairman and the committee can do to strengthen our resiliency against what I consider to be the great power competition, the biggest threat to the United States, looking to the next generation, and that is Communist China. So with that, I know I have some closing remarks that have to do with written statements will be allowed and so forth, but I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to seeing your addendum, your further testimony in writing to the issues I just raised. With that, this committee stands adjourned.